we're going to talk about the definitions of 18.1 and 18.2, go into ban lands and certificate of possessions, designation, leases, permits, surveys, and different websites you can go to. So reserves under section 18.1 of the Indian Act, reserves to be held for the use and benefit of the ban. And this is the whole reason why we have to do section 28.2s or designations or permits or leases or anything like that, because when they put the reserves off to the side for the First Nation, it's only meant for their members and nobody else. And section 18.2 of the Indian Act means that you could use the reserve for schools, churches, graveyards, anything like that. That's a communal use. And it's for the purpose of the general welfare of the band.
So the types of land on reserve, there's a couple different ones. There's band lands, which is reserve land that's held for the use and benefit of the band members as a whole. And then there's also traditional land holdings. So that's based on generations of historical occupancy of a certain area of the reserve land by an individual or family. And traditional holdings are not recognized through the Indian Act. Here in Northern Ontario, majority of bands will have band lands and some traditional holdings. And then there's a couple different types of lawful possession. So lawful possession is recognized under section 20.1 of the Indian Act. And it's the legal right to occupy, use, and benefit from reserve land that has been formally allotted to band members. And the allotment is usually done through a band council resolution. And you can also transfer your certificate of possession to other band members. There's a couple different types of a certificate of possession. If there's more than one person who is allotted a parcel of land, there could be joint tenancy, which has the right of survivorship. And what that means is if you and someone else have interest in the land and one of you passes away, the other person will get the sole interest in the land. You can't transfer it to someone else. There's also tenant in common, which has no right of survivorship. So if you pass away, your interest would pass down to your heirs. If the BCR is silent, then it would automatically be tenants in common if there's more than one person that is allotted the land. And it's really good if you do have a certificate of possession to make sure that you have a will, because it makes things easier on your family if in the future they have to deal with your estate. There's also certificate of occupations. So those are not transferable, and they're allotted. It's the right to use, occupy, and benefit from the reserve land, and it's allotted to band members for a maximum of 2 years. And you can have multiple people on a certificate of occupation, but the interest ends with you. So if you pass away before the maximum 2 years, it's done. You cannot pass that on. Yeah, and so conditions can be added to a certificate of occupation, but not to a certificate of possession. Any questions? Yes.
The certificate of occupation, you need a recognition first, then?
No, because it's for band members.
Yeah. So anytime you're going to issue a CP or CO, it has to be band land first. So if there is a designation, you're going to have to undesignate it first in order to issue a certificate of possession or occupation. Cool. Answer your question? Follow up? Thinking about it?
We're, for us at Note Comiguaning, we have members that are applying or requesting certificate of occupation because they want to build on their own, to build houses on their own. But at a land that we have, nobody's occupying that land right now. There's a hydro line going through, but there's no sewage, no water. And for me, like I've been on council for a few years already, and I still don't know the processes. Like I still don't. I don't know what the processes are for the certificate of occupation, and these people have been waiting, and like I'm just guessing, saying, hey, do we need to do a designation before we allow them to occupy the property? But I'm still
unclear.
yeah.
Okay, so normally whenever we do issue a certificate of occupation or a certificate of possession, we'll have to do a land status report first, because I know, especially with your First Nation, is that loud enough for people in the back? You guys are good?
One more. I just want to, because I'm just remembering this. So, and land code was mentioned too. So, and it'll take years to get your land code. We're working with an organization in BC. I don't know, maybe some of the folks heard about them. The FMB, I think it's FMB, or Lab.
Yeah.
Lands Advisory Board.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm just starting to, understand and learn the processes from them.
Yeah.
And so the land code, going back to the land code, that's going to be like a few more years if you want to, how does that affect the certificate of occupation? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. So normally, like I know with your First Nation, there's one of the few that actually we have in the Northern Ontario that do have CPs already. So we're going to have to do a land encumbrance check just to make sure that there's no existing certificate of possessions or easements or right-of-ways or anything like that. As long as it's banned land, it'll be at the discretion of the First Nation to give them a CP or a CO. So normally, in order to do that, it'll need a survey. So they have to go for a legal survey, and that's usually covered by the actual certificate of possession holder or somebody who's requesting it. Once they receive that, we'll just need a BCR from you saying, like, this person who's a member of our First Nation is allotted this portion of land. And like Julie was saying, like with CPs, they're non-conditional. So you can't say they have to meet these requirements. So they can't, if you have a land use plan or anything like that, you say it's dependent on this. It's non-conditional. So once you give that portion of land to that individual, is now the individual's land. The band council won't have a lot of say on what happens on it. But if you have a certificate of occupation, like Julie was saying, it's like a 2-year term. So you can have a list. I know with one of the First Nations we work with, they have a 2-page list of what the conditions are in order to get it or in order to keep it. So one of them is to actually build improvements. So if they don't have build improvements within that 2 years, it goes back to their inventory and they could use that parcel of land for another person or another use. Does that answer your question? And going into FNLM, because your First Nation, I think, is going to FNLM, right? They signed the agreement. So once they go into FNLM, any existing CPs it'll still be transferred to under your FNLM, but it won't be called a certificate of possession. It'll be called whatever you guys call it in your land code, but it'll still be to that individual. In the future, it depends on what your land code says on how people are going to get their own lawful interest.
Testing. They won't be like the processes too. Like that's sort of scary because we don't want like expropriation to even be like as an option, I guess, because I don't want to get this person mad right here. She's a CP holder in my community, Darlene. So, and we have a good relationship there in regards to CP land. But yeah, so it's going to be a huge process.
So what was your question? Or was that just the comments? You okay? Yeah.
I have a question as well. Thank you. Would you consider the certificate of occupation I guess, a transitional measure before you issue a certificate of possession, to see if they're going to be good tenants, to see if they're going to actually be good to their word to develop their property?
It'll be up to the band council. Like in the end, like we're not going to be like, we don't think that they met the conditions. It'll be done by band council resolution. So us at INAT or Indigenous Services Canada, we just look at the BCR, and as long as it meets our requirements, like encumbrance free, they have all the BCR wording and the survey, we'll go ahead and process it. It'll be up to the band council to actually give us that, because it'll be up to the band council to actually do their due diligence, seeing that they met those conditions in
Right.
order to get a CP. Yeah.
And so do certificates of occupation tend to be renewed over and over again, or does it generally transition into a CP?
After 2 years, it should transition to a CP.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Like 2 terms, sorry. So 4
As
years.
long as it's agreed, right?
Yeah, yeah.
My question is, why does ISC have a lot of say on the First Nation lands? Where the First Nation should be able to designate what they want to do on their own First Nation property.
That goes into a whole like legal ballgame, and that's why we wanted to cover section 18.1 and 18.2. I know like the Indian Act is very old and it's, you know, done in the way back in the day, but that's unfortunately like those are the rules that we're playing in right now. And if a First Nation wants to do something, we're gonna work with them to try and get what their end result is.
My community, we had a mill on our property. ISC came in, talked about land designation, and the question was posed to them, was there ever land designated for that construction of that mill that was on our First Nation property? And the answer to us was, what mill? That's not a very acceptable answer.
I agree, especially if it's a mill, people should be aware of it, and I'm not sure which First Nation you're from, but there's, you know, the thing is, like, there's development on reserves that we don't know anything about because we're,
They're the ones that designated their land.
Mhm.
So what gave them the right to do so without conversing with membership?
And a lot of the times that's what we're trying to avoid. Like, we're not going to go ahead and do a designation without the band council consent. We're trying to correct past mistakes.
No, so that's what I find funny is because there's still all that physical evidence and they still refuse to believe there was a mill on our property.
I want to ask what First Nation you're from?
Ganugaming First Nation.
Okay.
And they built a mill in our community and because they used to do the river drive.
Mhm.
And they were dumping all the logs in. But like I said, physical evidence is still there and they still don't acknowledge a mill ever being there and who designated the land to them in the first place.
Maybe we can have this conversation afterwards because I know that I did some research on Ganugaming like a few years back. So I'll be able to like, provide you a better answer. Okay? No. As soon as a First Nation has their own, as soon as a First Nation has their own land code, it goes into whatever their land code says. So this section of the Indian Act won't be applicable to it.
Does that mean matrimonial?
Like your matrimonial laws, it depends if you already have a law enacted. If you don't have a law enacted, you'll have to go through the federal provincial laws, like the matrimonial real property, or not matrimonial real property. But if you already have one, then you'll have to abide by those ones.
So if a First Nation doesn't have one, they don't have to.
No, if First Nation doesn't have one, they have the federal one to go by. Any other questions? We're good? Okay. Oh. It's my turn again. So, you know, the thing about being tall is like these things never reach up to my face. So this is the area that I actually do a lot about work in our Northwestern Ontario is designations. And these will not be applicable to the FNLM groups because they make their own laws on, or land code on how to designate land. So these are governed by the Indian Act and sections 37 to 41, chapter 5 of the Lands Management Manual, and the Indian Referendum Regulations. It occurs when any third-party interests, including banned corporations, would like to obtain a lease or a right of interest on reserve land. A designation is needed prior to a lease being administered. So one of our key questions whenever we're doing a project with the First Nation is, do you need a lease? If you need a lease, this is always step 1 of 2 in order to obtain the lease. And I'm just going to go over what the requirements are. So when we're designating land, the First Nation is giving up its collective right on the parcel of designated lands for a defined period of time to a third party for a specific use. And to make the transfer valid, the membership needs to be provided informed consent. We just changed this because there was a whole lot of specifics in this sentence. So basically what you're doing with this parcel of land is zoning it, and you're zoning it for a specific purpose. And in order to do that, we'll have to go through the Indian Referendum Regulations. Can you guys hear me in the back, or do I have to hold it up? Good? Can you hear me? I'm just going to take that as a yes. So when you're designating the land, it's no longer band land. So you can't use it at the pleasure of, you can't make a playground there, you can't make your band office there, you can't put a park there. It's for that specific use and normally for a specific person. So if you're going to designate it for, say, a casino, you can't do anything on that parcel of land other than make a casino. And one of the things about this is the informed consent. We go to the members and we give an information document, and we'll go into a little bit about that later. But we're giving them all the information that we know about the project, and we're asking, can you give up your collective interest in this parcel of land for the specific use? And that's, if they say yes, then we'll proceed with the whole designation. But that's the key thing, is the band is no longer in control of that parcel of land. Questions, comments? No? Okay, so we're going to go into how to designate. We do 3 different phases. First one is the pre-designation, and that's just getting all the information that we need in order to do it, to give the members the informed consent portion of it. So discussions happen between ISC and the First Nation. In Northwestern Ontario, it'll be me and whoever the proponent is at the time. And then we'll advise the First Nation, the proponent and or hired consultant, the mandatory requirements, which is the environmental assessment. Normally, we'll see if it's just a phase 1. Sometimes they'll have to go into phase 2. Very rarely it'll go into phase 3. But if it's going to phase 3, we're going to ask a lot of questions, mainly because once it's designated, it has to be returned to the same state or better. And if you're going into a phase 3, that means that there's a lot of contaminants already on that. And do we want it returned at the same, at the same level of contaminants? So it gets into a sticky situation. But normally, hopefully, it's usually just a phase 1. So this part of it is actually an undefined amount of time. So we don't know how long it's going to take to do a survey. Normally, when we do the surveys can take up to 1 year. Like the last one I did literally took almost 1 year to complete, and that was everything going smoothly. So it depends on the complexity, and if there's already post, and it all depends. With these ones, we do cover a lot of the cost, reasonable costs. I think that's a key word. So we'll cover, your legal, your financial. We'll cover the appraisal and the survey, and sometimes the environmental assessment, depending on what it is. And we'll cover the cost of the deputy electoral officer. For these, though, we'll like to do them in 2 different phases. Usually the first phase of funding will come in just for the survey, the appraisal, and the environmental assessment. And then the second year of funding will come in for the legal, the financial, any referendum costs that are associated with it. And at this point, we'll sit down.
Does that include CP?
No. CP, if an individual wants a certificate of possession, it's up to the individual to pay for it. Yeah. And like with this is just all for designations for economic development purposes.
For CP land, so you're saying that the individual holder has to pay their own, but yet the public one where the band pays for it, or you guys pick up the bill. So why is that?
Because it'll be at the pleasure of the band council. We'll be willing to pay to go for this full vote, but at the pleasure of the band council, it's going to be $5,000 per survey, and we just don't have that survey dollars. Because we have two different streams of funding, and one of them is specifically for economic development, and that's where we get the funding for the designations. We don't have a specific stream for surveys. Now, Sarah, do we have a specific stream for surveys? So I don't know if you guys heard Sarah, but you can apply for survey funding for certificates of possession, but those aren't our priorities, and it could take up to a couple of years to actually receive it. Questions, comments? No? Okay, moving forward. So that's our pre-designation phase. Once we have all that information, and it's all in an information document showing the appraisal value, who will be the leaseholder, where the legal survey is, we are ready to move into the referendum process. And this is pursuant to the Indian referendum regulations. So we have a big list of what rules we have to follow whenever we're doing a referendum for designations. So the First Nation will submit a BCR requesting a referendum. And like I said, that's after all the requirements are met. So you can't jump ahead and do this one and then get the requirements, because that just delays everything. And then once we are ready to go, we'll post the notice of referendum and mail out information packages. And that's 42 days before the day of the vote. We have to hold one information meeting, and that has to be on reserve, just because the ones on reserve normally don't get a mail-in packages, where the ones off reserve get mail-in packages. If your First Nation is requesting, though, we can do both on and off. It doesn't matter to us. And that has to be held at least 14 days after the posting and 1 day before the vote. And then after that, we conduct the referendum. And it's good to note that these are prescribed timelines. So if we miss a date at the beginning, that's going to shift the whole timeline back, or else we'll have to start again. So if you're in the middle and we miss an information meeting and that's already been posted and published, we have to start from scratch. Like that, there's just no way around it. And for this one, we can make a timeline commitment of it's going to be 49 days from start to finish. Questions? Comments? No?
What happens if a band decides to forego the whole designation process and simply lease their property by BCR to, say, a band-owned corporation?
So for us, that's called Bakshi, and there's lots of Bakshi arrangements that are done on reserve. So that means that they didn't have the legal requirements, they didn't go through the Indian Act, they didn't follow any of our prescribed recommendations. We're not going to go out there and police and be like, stop. We do get complaints saying the First Nation is doing this on our land and it's not benefiting us, or we don't see the benefits. We'll then be able to question the First Nation of why is this here? If it's self-funded, we can't do anything about self-funding things, because at that point it's at the leisure of the band. But if it's a band corporation, the only thing is with funding arrangements or getting any funding for it is the insurance clause, because the insurance clause, you have to have legal land tenure. And if you're there without any legal land tenure and they confirm with us, we're going to be they're not allowed to be there. So if something were to happen, you're just like your insurance. Sometimes they'll give you back the premiums, but that's about it. And you just wasted millions of dollars on infrastructure that you can't get back.
Hi, Kristen.
The insurance clause or Bakshi? Yeah, Bakshi. Yeah. And like I said, there's so many Bakshi arrangements, and we can't do anything about it. Yeah.
Just a comment. I know that I'm working with you right now in regards to the lands,
Yeah.
and so this is actually the first time I've seen you in person.
I know. I was gonna say.
So holy smokes!
We were just on a conference call with you guys, but anyways, yeah.
Okay, that's all I wanted to say. First, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to meet you. So yeah, I'm Kristen Cases. Questions, comments? No? Okay. So after the vote is done, oh wait, so this is the designation outcome. It's going to be a simple majority. This changed in like 2013. We used to have to do a two-phase vote. Now it's just a simple majority. If 5 people show up, 3 say yes, we're good to go with this designation. Wait, there's one other thing I just want to add on to this. I didn't put on the slide. After the designation's like done, we actually have to do a ministerial order. Ministerial orders are something after we do the designation, we have to put a package and it goes up to the minister to sign, and then it's eligible for leasing. So Julie's on this part.
Thanks. So leasing. So in order to have a lease, the land has to be designated, and that's pursuant to subsection 53(1) of the Indian Act. Any land that's designated under subsection 38(2), it can be leased for any purpose that is specified in the designation document. And that's the real sticking point. If your designation document says the land is designated for cottage leases, that's what you can lease on the land. Just cottages. So prior to any lease being administered, the designation has to be complete, and that includes having the environmental site assessment. It also must be complete. And there's a legal framework for leases. The leases possess a certain legal characteristic which governs the relationship between the lessor, so like the landlord, and the lessee, the tenant. And under a lease, the landlord grants the tenant exclusive possession of the land. So for our leasing templates, the lessor is the Crown Canada, and the lessee is, if it's a cottage, it's the person who's going to have the cottage. And that's just because under Section 18(1) of the Indian Act, the lands are held by the Crown for the benefit and use of the First Nation. And the lease is for a fixed period of time during which the exclusive possession will run. So it could be 10 years, 5 years. It all will depend, again, on your designation document. So the maximum term for the lease has to be 1 day less than the designation term. So if you have land that you've designated, say, for 10 years, your maximum term for the lease is 9 years and 364 days. And the designated land will still retain its reserve status. It's still part of the reserve. And there's kind of an increased flexibility into dealing with that reserve land. And there's 3 main types of leases. There's commercial leases. So that's when the leased property is intended for commercial or industrial ventures. So things like shopping centers, manufacturing facilities, restaurants, water, theme parks, gas stations, retail sales outlets, hotel facility, mobile park home. It's also for major multifamily projects like a condominium, apartment buildings, or subdivision development. You could have a cottage or residential lease, which is used for a single family for seasonal or year-round cottage purposes. Or you could have an agricultural lease, which is appropriate for the grazing of livestock, the growing of agricultural crops. But you could also, most grazing and cash crop arrangements can be dealt through Section 28(2) permit. And then, before I move on to the steps, any questions about anything so far? No? Okay. So the steps to draft the lease, we have a standard lease form, and it lists anything that needs to be changed in red. And that, keeping in mind that if you make changes to the text that's in black on the form, it would have to go back through the Department of Justice for review. But if you're just changing the red parts, it should probably be okay. The lease is negotiated between the First Nation and the proponent. And the proposed use of land and the specific development or activity plan should be clearly agreed upon in that lease. You should have a proposed term of the lease. The legal description of the land to be leased needs to be in the lease. And there should be something establishing the rent and the rent review period. And then after that, the First Nation would submit a BCR consenting to the specific negotiated terms and conditions to the proponent. The lease would be drafted for signatures. Everyone would sign it and finalize the document. Then it would come into the department. We would register it in the lands registry. And once it's registered, we distribute it out to all the parties. Any questions about that? Okay. Continuing on to permits. So the permits allow for non-members to use the reserve land in a limited way for a specific period of time. So that would be something like a hydro line, utilities, the right-of-way. It doesn't give exclusive possession of the land, so you can have more than one permit for a parcel. So you could have hydro running a line through and then Bell running a telecom line. And it just has to make sure that they're not conflicting with each other. Right? And a survey and environment requirements also need to be satisfied for permits. And then pursuant to Section 28.2 of the Indian Act, permits grant such access as utility services to the reserve and grazing or agricultural purposes where exclusive use is not required. Permits for utility rights of way only where the primary purpose is to service the reserve. Section 58.4 of the Indian Act, permit is for the removal of clay, sand, gravel, and other non-metals, wild grass, or fallen timber. I'll pass it on to you.
When a permit comes to the end, a road agreement, where does ISC fit into addressing that, your lease is coming, or your permit is coming to an end? When does ISC step in and sit down and renegotiate with the First Nation, with industry, a new road agreement?
So for road agreements, anything like that, it has to be coming from the First Nation, because like I said, like we want to move away from saying like you guys have to do this, you have to do this. So if the First Nation comes to us saying like, this road agreement is coming up to expiration date, we want to renegotiate, and we'll always tell you like, here's a permit template. If you want to negotiate these terms, by all means. It's usually they'll come to us if they have any issues or if they feel like, they're not getting the best, like, an appraised value or.
Yeah, okay, I understand what you're saying, but seems like ISC now is dropping the ball back on the First Nation, but yet we still have to go through these regulations, appropriate these lands or whatever for commercial, industrial. But when it comes down to these, it seems like the First Nation now has to start negotiating on their own with industry, where INAC was involved ISC was involved at the start, but now it seems like ISC is now dropping the ball and placing all the onus back on the First Nations.
See, that was one of the things that we want to avoid is like a comment that you made earlier is like ISC is making you guys do this. We're not going to make you guys do anything that you don't feel comfortable with. So that's why we're saying like if you want to renegotiate a new agreement, you can. But if you're saying like, we're not going to allow this person on our land and they're starting to, like, infringe or encumber or whatever, that's when we'll come in and we'll actually take, there's a big difference of like somebody coming in unauthorized versus you guys need to negotiate a new agreement. Sorry?
I said, we were just told they think differently a few years ago. So what you're saying to me right now, I'm finding hard to.
I know, and that's the thing is like our policies have been changing, and it also depends on our manager. Because in the Ontario region, we have a new manager now. It's no longer Shannon, so and it depends what our policy says, because policy changes as well. So I know like sometimes it is different, like even with our designations, they're different from what they were 5 years ago, like with our processes. And it just depends on what new policies that we get. Okay. So we're jumping into Sand and gravel permits. So for aggregate permits, it's a little bit different than getting regular permits, because under the aggregate permits, it's under 58.4B of the Indian Act versus the regular permits are 28.2s. With the sand and gravel permits, we do need a survey. Most of the time it's just an administrative plan, which means there has to be already a full survey, and then we could draw a red box where the actual pit's going to be. There has to be a general meeting of the band, and usually there has to be a vote. We're held in favor of the proceeding with the permit. We're not going to ask for proof. We're just going to ask for BCR saying that this was done and what the, if it was a positive vote. They have to have an approved restoration and operational plan. So how they're going to run the mill, or not the mill, sorry. How they're going to run the pit and how they're going to restore it afterwards. And the key term of how much they'll be receiving is 100,000 cubic meters. So that's the biggest difference between the 28.2s and 58.4Bs. Questions? Comments? No? We're good? Okay, so are you doing the steps or? Okay. No? So, okay. Shh. Just kidding.
Several years ago, I worked for a First Nation, and we had a woman come through our reserve, and she said that she had a placer mine
Okay.
on our reserve, and upon further investigation, we first told her she had no right to access this placer mine because it was right in the middle of our reserve lands. But it turned out that she actually did have full legal right to access that placer mine, and I'm wondering, like, is this a permit with the province maybe that supersedes the Indian Act? I'm not entirely sure how that works.
No, on Canada lands, the province won't be able to come on. It would depend, because sometimes there were surrenders done like in the early 1900s, and that's where they're stemming all of the instruments from. But yeah, I wouldn't know until I actually looked at the instruments to kind of
Right.
determine how she was able to be there. Yeah.
Right. We
Yeah.
actually had 3 placer mines in our land, in our territory,
Mhm.
that our chief and leadership did not want accessed by the holders of those placer claims,
Mhm.
but they had no teeth in the argument. So I just was wondering how that worked and sort of what the ramifications were of having people having free access to our territory.
Normally, like if it's territory versus reserve is a bit like a big difference, because like on reserve they won't be able to do that unless like I said, there might be historical documents allowing them, and then it just was passed down depending. I wouldn't know until I actually read them. But for like traditional land, that's crown land for some of the time, and we don't really, us at INAC, we won't be able to have a big say on like what happens on the crown land. Yeah.
In our reserve, right on our river.
Yeah, I would definitely ask about that. And it could be like, because you know how sometimes like the reserve boundaries doesn't go to the water's edge. It depends on like, what the survey plan said, what it was.
We did a lot of investigations at our reserve land, like high water mark, and
Yeah.
her claim was within our boundaries.
Yeah, so, yeah. Unfortunately, I won't be able to comment too much on that. Sorry.
Any other comments? Questions?
I'm just wondering, have you ever helped any First Nations do the addition to reserve land? I know it's probably.
No, with us, we're kind of split up right now, where we're already dealing with people who are under the Indian Act on reserve land, and then we have another additions to reserve group who actually do the ATR work for, adding to reserve. So, yeah, in the Ontario region. I don't know are you from the Ontario region?
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, we have our ATR group who actually do all the ATR work for it. And they have assigned communities and everything. So we can talk later and I can get you contact information for that.
I've got another question here, last question for you. I won't ask any more questions after this.
No, you're making our
But,
time good.
I'm just wondering, how do you correct the wrong? Whereas, how does industry have a lifetime ownership of the water lot before our community?
So what do you mean, like, how do you correct, like, normally, like, anything like that will actually go into a claim, so it'll go into a specific claim, and that goes into our Ottawa group. So then from there, they'll be able to figure out the compensation value.
But I'm just wondering who designated the water lot to them in the first place. Whereas, okay, the river I'm talking about, back in the day, it only used to be 2 feet wide. And when they came and built the hydro dams, they flooded the area out. Now that's about a 30-foot wide river now versus just a footbridge back in the day. So how does industry say they own all that piece of area through the water lot?
So unfortunately, there's no like cut and dry answer for that, because like I said, like those will go into claims, and they're going to have to go into historical research into it. And I'm not sure what has been done with Ganoogaming and like their claims for, like, I know that they recently had a claim in the past like 10 years, I believe. But I'm not privy to what happened on the claims and how it was, yeah. But unfortunately, yeah, with that, like anything with past doing, it goes into like specific claims. Yeah. Good? Okay. So going back to permits. ISC confirms that the proposed use falls within the scope of the statutory authority being relied upon in Section 28.2, Section 53.1, or 58.4 of the Indian Act. So we've seen some funny stuff come through where the Band Council wants to put a cottage leasing for 2 years, or a cottage permit for 2 years on, and they want to go under Section 28.2. They used to do that back in the 50s and 60s, and we started getting in trouble and getting sued, so we stopped doing that. So if it doesn't fit under our scope, we're going to just tell you, you'll need a designation, or else unfortunately we won't be able to do it because you have to get membership approval. But as long as it fits, we'll keep on going. So we're going to conduct a search to ensure that there are no previous conflicting encumbrances on the subject lands. We're going to brief the First Nation Council and the permittee on the scope of the permits and mandatory provisions. And with most permits, we already have a template. So what we'll be doing is sending you the template and saying, like I said, what Julie was saying, like if there's a red section where you can touch, black section where we have to actually go back to our DOJ approval and figure out what the ramifications are if we did change it. So the proposed permittee pays for and performs an assessment of the environmental effects on the project according to the Impact Assessment Act and its regulations. With these ones, it depends on the situation. Most of the time it's hydro or a provincial body requesting a 28.2, and they have the funding to do it. But if it's more of a band corporation, we'll look into it as an economic development opportunity, and we'll try and get funding for it, so we're not trying to put the hook on First Nation or their band corporation. So the First Nation Council and or the locatee may negotiate the terms of the permit with the proponent. These terms would include the fee, the location, and the period. Any substantial changes would be reviewed by the Department of Justice, who's our legal. And First Nation will submit a BCR consenting to the granting of proposed permit with specific negotiated terms and agreements. Any other questions? Comments? No? Clear as mud? Go.
Okay, coming to surveys. So, survey boundaries on Canada lands can only be surveyed by a Canada land surveyor. The Canada Land Surveyor, or CLS, they're authorized by the Surveyor General for Canada to conduct these surveys, and that's through NRCan, Natural Resources Canada. They issue the survey instructions, and those Canada Land Surveyors have to follow the instructions that NRCan gives them. And so any kind of surveys on the reserve would need to be done by NRCan, by their Canada Land Surveyors. We do have a question? Yes.
Yeah, bonjour. Skandara Noji. So, Mani Kagote Egon. So, I'm from the Skandara, and I want to ask a question. About 10 years ago, we had a survey from ISC, and our for future infrastructure. And on this survey, we lost an excavator in a swamp where ISC doesn't want to get involved in it to take it out. So how does that work in your policies, your permits, your designation lands, and all the rules you guys are making? And you can't correct your own mistake. You know, like in my community, I believe it's an unceded territory. And hearing you guys speak about the lands, I don't know whether it was given to you guys. You know, you guys all know it's all First Nation land in Canada. And I'd like to know what, you know, where First Nations were not consulted about, you know, these policies and stuff. You know, everything's new because it's never implemented to the communities. When communities ask something, you know, there's a stumbling block all the time. You know, you see why there's all kinds of issues in the community because of these policies. You know, we should be allowed to build anywhere where we want to. You know, that's my thought. So thank you very much. Be good.
So, yeah, there is an interdepartmental agreement between ISC and NRCan that outlines the tasks and responsibilities for each party when it comes to the surveys.
So I just wanted to acknowledge what you said. Like, you know, we're working within what we're given right now, and like, you know, that's the only way that we can move forward. But whenever we do change our policies, one of the things that we do go through is like the AFN and the National Aboriginal Lands Manager Association, and their provincial bodies who are supposed to be representing the First Nations within Canada who do instruments. So I know, like, especially within our northern communities, they don't have such a strong presence. And I think part of that is also because you guys do your own thing, right? So we don't. Yeah, and that's what the rules that we're given, because, you know, we're just small folks on a big scale.
Well, this survey was done for future infrastructure. And today the excavator's still sitting in the swamp. Nobody wants to take it out. It's doing the environment impact already.
And that
it's from ISC survey.
See, because like that's the thing is like we'll have to do a little bit of background on that, just because like that's normally we don't do the surveys. We'll do the funding for the surveys, and it'll be outsourced to somebody else. So if that wasn't done properly, we'd have to look into it at least.
Well, we were told there was a specialist from ISC to come and do the survey for us. Because we know our land. We know where we want to put our houses. We know where the terrain is, you know?
Yeah, and I find that...
And somebody else out there that doesn't live in the community comes and tell us, you put a house here, you put a house there. It doesn't work, you know? That's why our housing is very, very poor, you know? Like it has lots of mold, it has lots of, you know, lots of failures on the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Because First Nations are not recognized what they know. Because we know the land, we live in it.
Yeah.
And we use it. You know, and we're still disappointed for a decade where the excavator is stuck, where the department doesn't want to get involved anymore. He says, it's on you guys' expense to take it out. And I don't think it's right. You know, it's a human right thing. Tell you that much. Thank you.
Okay, and you know, that's one of the things, like, I don't mind digging into something like that, because for me that right away sounds like it wasn't done properly, and that just sounds off altogether. So we can talk afterwards and I'll get more details from you. Okay. we're done. Okay. Yay. So the website, it's for the Indian Lands Registry System. So this is a public website where if you want to know what's happening on your land or get a parcel abstract report to see what kind of permits, leases, designations, CPs, BCRs are on your reserve, you can actually go to this website and print off your parcel abstract report. If you do want to see any of the documents, you will have to email us and then we'll be able to send it from there. The survey plan search, this is where you can find any survey that was also done on any federal lands and on your First Nation. The interdepartmental agreement between ISC and NRCan, shows our requirements, what we need in terms of surveys for permits, leases, designations, any sort of instrument. And one thing I do want to plug is the Ontario Aboriginal Lands Association, because I'm talking about like there's so many different permits and leases and anything like any activity happening in Ontario. They actually have, this is just a lot of lands managers within Ontario who do networking, they do private training, they help each other out. So if we can't answer their questions right away, they honestly, most of them just go here and talk amongst themselves and they'll be able to find a path forward. So if your First Nation is interested, let me know and I can hook you up with a person. Other than that, I don't have anything else to say. So does anybody have any questions or comments? No?
Anybody else? Questions, comments?
No?
We're done?
We're good?
Okay, I want to present a gift for the two ladies here. This gift's for you for the housing working group.
Awkward. Thank you.
And one for you. Okay, we're all wrapped up now, so I don't know if anybody else wants questions. Probably not. So we're all done. Miigwech, everybody.